Welcome to the first episode of the Sherlock and Pages book club. Today we have a very, very special guest, Becky Brown, who is a literary agent, an author, and her job title is co-head of Curtis Brown Heritage. And she has just been nominated for the Literary Agent of the Year. Is that correct, Becky?
Co-nominated with my co-head, Nora. And yes, and it's a big and surprising honour, and we're the first people ever to be nominated for working with literary estates, which for the uninitiated is dead writers.
And this is at the Nibbies, right?
Yes.
Can you explain what the Nibbies are? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, they're called the Nibbies because if you win, you get a giant golden pen nib.
That's
but they're
quite cool.
actually the British Book Awards. And that's everything from kind of, best crime writer to like best publisher to best imprint and best literary agent.
So that's for the publishing industry. Can you win as an author? Or is it like
yes, you can win as an author.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. And so this you're going to find out very soon.
This Monday.
Okay, so we'll keep you all updated on how Becky gets on at the Nibbies. And without further ado, we are here in this first episode to look at the last quarter of the moon. I've been reading this, Becky's been reading this, and much to our surprise here at Sherlock and Pages, many of you out there have been reading the book as well, from as far away as Oregon to Australia, Poland to Toronto, and of course many people in more normal places for us like Dorset and Derbyshire. So although we welcome all, thank you. It's been a really interesting read. For those who haven't read The Last Quarter of the Moon, these podcast episodes or YouTube episodes are going to cover some of the detail of the book, but we're not going to go in depth on the plot line. So I think this will be interesting to people who've read the book as part of the book club. And if you haven't read it, I think unless you're really allergic to spoilers, I think hopefully we should give you some inspiration. And actually, me and Becky were just discussing, we kind of feel this is a little bit of a spoilerless book because it's a book kind of for its atmosphere rather than its plot line necessarily, but we'll get into that. It tells the story of the Evenki tribe, but we think it might be called the Evenk. Some have called it online as the Ewenk. So any experts out there, do let us know. It covers the 20th century and is told from the perspective of a 90-year-old lady looking back on the great tragedies and events of that time for her tribespeople, the indigenous people of northwest China. It kind of covers some areas of modern-day Heilongjiang and Inner Mongolia as well. And what I really enjoyed about this is that the narrator starts off the book with literally a fireside chat. So you kind of are very much wrapped into a magical storyline from the very start. My first question, I'm going to leave it quite open, Becky, is would you recommend the book? And if so, which type of readers would you recommend The Last Quarter of the Moon to?
I would definitely recommend the book. I think that's quite an easy, thank you, that's an easy first question. It is a pretty, it's the kind of book where you can't quite imagine how you could learn, or maybe perhaps, actually I'm going to rephrase that, I'm going to say, you can't quite imagine a better way to learn the history of the Evenki people than to read their story in fiction. They are a tribe, actually for the most part, without a written language of their own. There is one now, I was looking at this on Wikipedia earlier, but one of the points of the story is that they don't have a written language.
Is that true? Because in the book, one of the characters is actually trying to create
at the
script.
end he's trying to create a script, and I did Google this earlier because I should say I went into that. I know you knew a little bit about this landscape and these people before you read the book. I went in entirely blind, so I did a lot of kind of post-reading Wikipediaing to try and kind of understand geographically and kind of religiously where they sit within that part of the world. But actually, although on the kind of Russian side of the river, and I guess we'll maybe talk a bit about the role the river plays in this book, but on the Russian side, they started trying formally to write their language in the 1920s, but on the Chinese side, it was a bit later, and it is a part of the story, one of the children trying to kind of create pictograms that adequately express their language. And I guess actually even more than their language, their way of looking at the world, which is quite unique to them.
Because, let's call them the Evenki for the purposes of this episode. They are one of, I think, 56 of the ethnic makeup of China. But I have read, and I have some experience working in China as well, that there are many, many more. And actually some of these, in the 1950s, 1960s, some of these ethnic minorities were brought into groups that actually didn't really represent them. But essentially there are 56. And the Evenki are one of those 56 recognized ethnic groups in China. I think because the Han Chinese, which covers the vast majority of the population, are also in that 56 as well. But my reason for choosing the book was because I had actually travelled to Inner Mongolia maybe 5 years ago now. And I was looking at deforestation, which plays a massive role in this book, and attempts to recover from deforestation. But the areas that I visited, although they're in Inner Mongolia is absolutely huge. I did look, it's 12 days walk from the Khingan mountain range, where the last quarter of the moon is set from where I went. And the Mongolian script was everywhere. And the Mongolian people were trying to keep their native culture alive. But it was that end of the nomadic period in the 1990s, which is so similar to what's been reflected in here. So I'm really glad that I chose the book, but you'd never heard of it before.
No, but I mean, and actually to circle back to your question of why I would recommend it, I think it's an extraordinary history of a people, and I can't think of a better way to learn it than to read this novel. So yeah, I would wholeheartedly recommend reading it. And I think, in terms of the kind of reader it would appeal to, I think anyone who is drawn to beautiful writing about the natural world, anyone who likes to kind of travel in their mind, I think it would appeal to people who enjoy magical realism as well.
Yeah.
It's sort of, I think I would recommend it to anyone who wants to be somewhere else when they're reading.
Yeah. And from a practical point of view, in terms of the actual structure of the novel, I found that it moved incredibly fast, but that didn't take away from the experience for me. And I found that it was very simple. So big events and big emotions could actually be captured in very short sentences or paragraphs. And because it covers a whole century, I found myself constantly invested in this this community. I'm just wondering if you found it easy to read, and any reflections on how it reads as a novel, because I found it quite simple, really.
Yeah, so I mean, it has a 3-part structure, and you have at the beginning of each of those 3 parts. In fact, is it in fact a 4-part? Actually, I'm going to correct myself. Is there a tiny 4th part at the end?
There's 3 parts, and then there's the last quarter of the moon, which is
okay. I'm going to revise
kind of a reflection at the end, because each of those parts starts with the main character, who does remain nameless throughout, talking as a 90-year-old on a mountainside, whilst the rest of her people have gone into a local township. And this kind of process has been happening really for the last 30, 40 years, you in different ways throughout the book. And I found that lovely to be brought back to the narrative. But then she kind of says, right, now I'm going to continue my story, which I just thought was lovely.
Yeah, it gives it a kind of, I think obviously she's our narrator, so she accompanies us through it anyway, but the kind of enduringness of her and the way other characters kind of, you know, sort of move in and then fall away. And, you know, sometimes I think it almost has got a nomadic structure. You know, she is our sort of central person, so we're always in her mind, but she is always moving and the people around her are always changing. It's full of death as a book. You know, it feels like somebody probably dies every few pages, and she's very kind of sanguine about that. She has I think her sort of incredibly long view on life, both because she's been alive for 9 decades, but also because she kind of carries within her the history of her people, means that everything is kind of not trivialized, but things happen very rapidly and often they're of great magnitude.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 questions that are prompted from that. One is, how did you feel the author deals with the massive epic history of China during this period? Because the amount of history that's mentioned in the novel could have been ridiculous, because it goes from the early parts of the rise of communism in China, the Japanese invasion during the war, there's the Cultural Revolution. You get snippets of what's happening with Mao's land reforms. There's all sorts of big history. And then I guess the opening up of China in the late 70s, early 80s. How did you find that to read? And I don't know how much of that history you kind of familiar with before.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with a fair amount of the history. I mean, in a kind of very broad sense. I thought actually it was a really brave decision to allow those things to touch on the narrator and her community, but never really to dwell on them. You know, you don't really, you know, so you sort of see the kind of rule of the Japanese, and then, you know, you see their kind of falling away and the arrival of the Soviets, and then, you know, you kind of stage by stage, all those things are there, but they only touch them in quite trivial ways. Like, you know, the impact of kind of man-made history on what is a centuries-old way of life is quite, you know, the kind of like mosquito bites in you know, they're as important and as unimportant as someone slipping on a mushroom and dying. You know, they are given as much time.
Yeah, when I conceived, because I was writing questions for the podcast, and obviously this is our first trial run, so hopefully we're doing a good job. I thought of the big macro histories that are layered onto the story of this tribe almost as little touches of paint on an oil painting. It just kind of gives you a flavour of what is to come. And I found that really enjoyable, because it's a good lesson for anyone who wants to write a novel as well, because it really doesn't try and do too much, I don't think.
I think she handles time very cleverly. You know, at the beginning in her childhood, when she doesn't really have a personal sense of being a part of history or of anything else, you know, there are no dates. You can kind of very roughly work out from how old she is in the kind of overarching storytelling part that it must be the early 20th century.
Yeah.
But other than that, you really don't know. It could be 1910 or it could be 1929.
That's a really good point, because I remember when the first date appears, whether it's in 1932 or something like that.
Yes, I think it is 1932.
It was a bit quite jarring, and it really kind of senses you. But I think you were kind of already there anyway. You get a good impression. Yeah. My second question, though, was one that I deal with here at Sherlock Pages in the bookshop all the time. A lot of people come in and want a novel, but they say they don't want to read something too sad, too overwhelming. And I think that probably reflects the experience of the pandemic. I think a lot of the bad news in the world as well. But people obviously don't want something really twee. And often they ask questions that, as a bookseller, are quite hard to gauge emotionally exactly what people are looking for. What would you say to someone who comes into a bookshop and says, I want to read a great novel, I don't want something that's too sad, and they start looking at The Last Quarter of the Moon? Because there is an awful lot of death in it, but the novel is also, in my view, very funny, which sounds like a complete contradiction. I don't know how you reflect on that.
I don't think I laughed reading it, but I don't think I found it sad either. I mean, I think if someone says they don't want a sad book, I know a lot of books I would push them away from, but this wouldn't be one of them. I think that there is a sort of pain in reading about what is really the death of a culture, and there's a kind of seed of hope at the very end, which I won't spoil because I think it might be the most beautiful image in the book. But on the whole, this is a woman watching the forest that she grew up in be cut down for, in commercial logging, watching a nomadic people being persuaded, sometimes by force, sometimes by incentive to, settle in one place. It's difficult to read it without kind of, without your mind traveling to the many ways that our life on this earth damages the things around us. But at the same time, it's also really hopeful. And I think it has a lot of, it's amazing to be, and quite joyful to be in the head of a person whose relationship with the environment is so symbiotic and beautiful, and to know that is a kind of possibility.
Well, that is another reason why I picked the book, not just the kind of the history of it and relating to my own experience going to Inner Mongolia. There was the opening lines of the book are relatively famous. The narrator says, "A long time confident of the rain and snow, I am 90 years old. The rain and snow have weathered me, and I too have weathered them." And I'm not surprised that the publisher chose to put that quote on the back cover. But then I started reading on, and very soon after, she says, "I won't sleep in a room where I can't see the stars. All my life, I've passed the night in their company." And reading those lines and then reading a bit further on, I just thought, this is our first book club pick. I'm so into this. However, one of the thoughts that I had reading it, I think we can romanticize in like Indigenous communities, but we were all Indigenous once, and I feel like that would be a bit of a cliche. What actually made me laugh, and I did laugh out loud several times, was when I really related to what was going on. I think there's one of the characters, one of the women, gets absolutely battered at someone's wedding and then pours a bag of flour over someone she's really upset with. And this, like, not that that's happened at any family weddings I've been to, but it
Maybe
was so relatable. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I've never done that, just for the record, but I do. I mean, I think as well they're these micro communities, and they have everything in them, even on like the smallest possible scale. And the way she's such a keen observer of character, the narrator, and not just the character of people either, the character of things. And I was fascinated by that, the kind of shame. I had to Google this because I was like, is this shamanism or is it animism? But essentially their core belief is that all the things around them have a spirit. And she speaks about the kind of the tools they use, the structures they live in, the reindeer, the trees as individuals. And I think that actually sometimes has a real sort of humor in it too, when she's kind of conversing with everyone. Like at the beginning you called it a fireside chat, but that kind of skims over slightly the fact she's talking to the fire.
Yeah, that's true. And there's a bit in the book where they write about it as if they keep the cinders of the fire, so that fire has been kept for hundreds of years, time immemorial. It was almost the impression that I had, and that is so just really, really special. I was quite surprised. The shamanism in the book is a massive theme. It's kind of dominant throughout. Although that dies away, they kind of put that to bed at the end, which is quite tragic. I was quite surprised when there was a female shaman appeared. Did that strike you as surprising at all? I don't know why. I guess that's my kind of Christian world upbringing. I just didn't know that. I was naive about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think because the structure of the tribe feels quite patriarchal. That in that there are a man is the clan chief, and men and women have quite separate roles. And when we start, the clan chief's brother is the shaman. So yeah, I guess I was surprised as well until you learn how someone becomes one, and then you realize that it's something that doesn't affect gender. You know, gender doesn't affect. It's a tool.
And it was interesting for me how a shaman is created, or they're born, and a lot of it comes down to character. And it seems like people who are a little bit different do things a little bit strangely as children or as they're growing up into their teenage years. And I think we've all probably met them in our own lives, or maybe we are. They're kind of earmarked as someone who could be able to connect with the spirit world a lot better. And I found this really poetic, and I was kind of thinking on my own life. Sometimes you just got to let people do their own thing and bring value to society. So I did find that really interesting. I wanted to go into a few of the views of the wider book club. And sorry we haven't been able to do this live. I don't know where I'm looking, by the way. I'm kind of looking at Becky, but then I'm going to look at the imagined audience, you guys out there. Sorry we didn't do this live because we're just kind of learning as we're going. But I've been asking for comments on Instagram and on Facebook, and I think it's pretty much been ubiquitously positive. One person said that they would put it in their top 5 novels of all time, which for me, I say is like sacred territory. I wouldn't put it in my top 5 of all time. I would kind of say for me, it was really, really enjoyable. I could read it quite quickly. I was constantly gripped. I think it'd be a really good holiday read if you're in the right place, given everything we've already said. I don't know where you would kind of, or even if you like that question of like ranking, I don't know if you read far more novels than me, I'm sure.
I'm always really interested when people rank books. So when I used to manage the internship at my literary agency, and we would ask people for their top 5 books, and probably 6 in 10 people had exactly the same top 5, which is probably because they were saying what they thought we would want to hear. But I think for me, for something to be in my top 5, it has to be more than a great read, even more than a brilliant read. It has to lodge somewhere, like somewhere really, it has to connect in a really important way. And I think actually for me, this could kind of never be in my top 5 because it's a slippery book. I think it doesn't want you to be in it. It wants you to watch it. I think, I really kind of hate talking about authors' intent because unless they've mapped it out incredibly clearly, it almost feels quite arrogant. But I don't think that this is a book you're meant to stay in. I think it's a book you're meant to pass through. And so I wouldn't put it in my top 5. What's in your top 5? Oh,
I don't know. Putting me on the spot. Maybe we should do that. We can come back and do a top 5 at some other point. I can't think off the top of my head. I think it constantly shifts as well, because I think what you said is true, that it does resonate at a certain time. And I probably need to read more female authors as well. I know. That's why, partially, I chose Chi Zijian. Some of the other people online said that the translation was particularly good, and the use of Indigenous words from the language is really nice when you're going through it. Although I find that when I'm reading books like this, I kind of probably create the noises in my head that are nowhere near, like the Shurangju, which is a...
Is that how you say it?
It's like the temporary home. Well, in my head it's that, but I don't know what it
that's how I
actually
was pronouncing it in my head as well.
And I did think that was really good. So the translator, I believe, is American. I have listened to a podcast with him on. Well, it says Bruce Humes is an American literary translator and critic of Chinese literature. I think he did an incredible job. I actually thought he might be British at one point reading it, because there's some of the like comedic one-liners when someone's being particularly dismissive maybe of another character, just had a bit of a British tone, but I think I was reading too much into that. And there were some other comments which I thought were really good, which I wanted to read out. Amy Lucas said that the book was touching, and that's how she would kind of sum up the book. So it definitely seemed to emotionally connect with a lot of people who read it. There's a strong emotional thread throughout. And she also commented on the deft touch that the author had in terms of dealing with the big histories of the outside world, and it touching on the novel. And I forgot that Amy wrote that, but it was definitely something that I found as well. We were discussing before, Becky, books that this made us think of or that we would be interested in reading next. And we both had one that immediately jumped out at us, which was...
Wild Swans.
Which I have...
It's somewhere on the table.
A copy of here. So this is Wild Swans. I think it's probably sold about 15 million copies by now. But I find that books that have sold that many copies fall into two categories. They're either absolutely amazing or they're absolutely terrible. And I think this one falls into the absolutely amazing territory. And this is familiar because it tells basically Chinese 20th century history through the eyes of 3 generations of women. I believe it's been a while since I've read it. But it's non-fiction, but it reads like fiction. So I think if you've not read Wild Swans, it's like an all-time classic.
Yeah. And it's, do you know, I think it really, I read Wild Swans when I was very young. It was on my grandma's bookcase. And I used to go and stay there for kind of a fortnight at a time, and I ran out of books. And it really shaped my expectations of what this book was going to look like. And I think, you know, anyone who's read Wild Swans will know that it's an absolutely brutal book. Like I still, some of the kind of scenes in that book have never left me. And so I think actually I was surprised by how gentle The Last Quarter of the Moon was comparatively. I expected it to have a lot more kind of brutality in it, I suppose. And I think that definitely came from Wild Swans.
I think that's a really good point. And I've read quite a lot of books about Chinese history. And when I was reading The Last Quarter of the Moon, when it started to touch on events like the Cultural Revolution, I was expecting a lot worse to happen. Now, some bad things do happen, really bad things, but the Cultural Revolution is so wildly traumatic and crazy. It's really hard for me to comprehend that this can happen in any society. And I think that definitely comes through in Wild Swans and then other broader histories of China that you might read. So I think that's a really good point. And I think it would have been good for people if they've not read a little bit more broadly. I think they'd get some really good value out of doing that. And Wild Swans is just such an absolutely amazing read, in short. On a geographical point, Colin Threbron, amazing travel writer, has just brought out a book called The Amur River, which plays such a big role. Oh, sorry, Sam, the podcast manager, director, was telling me to show you this a bit more clearly. Here we go. Got the thumbs up. I really want to read this. It's a journey that he goes through, rising in the Mongolian mountains and flowing through Siberia to the Pacific. The Amur River forms the tense border between Russia and China. This is the most densely fortified frontier on Earth. In his 80th year, Colin Threbron takes a dramatic and often treacherous journey from the Amur's secret source to its giant mouth. And then it goes on. I think that's really interesting because that border seems definitely present in the novel, but there's actually scenes in it when the Evenki tribe's men, and they are men, get drafted, co-opted, corralled into the Japanese army when the Japanese take over Manchuria, and actually go on reconnaissance missions using, I think, some of their skills in boating and awareness of the landscape into Russia. And that impression that the borders are kind of really porous in the Evenki culture, I found an interesting part. You mentioned the river in the introduction. I just wonder if you had any reflections on what role the river played for you in the book.
Yeah, it's interesting because it kind of as the world that they're in shifts and as their tribe shift, it kind of becomes. It changes from being something that represents danger to something that represents safety to something that represents danger again. And actually, it made me think about that thing about kind of how. It made me think about that kind of lack of brutality, as it were, or the way that the writer deals with those kind of intrusions into their world and the things that happen to them. For example, with the arrival of the Japanese tribeswoman who has Russian origins, flees across the river with her children, and because she's heard that people with blue eyes are not welcomed by the Japanese. And that's kind of, it all boils down to that. Like, that's the sort of, it in their world, it's not a bigger thing than that. It's not a question of ethnicity or allegiance or, geopolitics. It's the colour of their eyes. It's a much more kind of literal and natural thing. And at that point, that river is her, it is a crossing into another world, and a world that she doesn't come back from. And, there are deaths that happen in the river. There are kind of quite key events in her life that happen on the river, like the killing of the elk. And her paintings, of course, which are such a kind of important part, I think, of how she expresses herself. And I think one of the most interesting elements in the novel, they happen by the river.
There was a part in the book when she was going through so much trauma, the main character, that I actually thought in my head, I can imagine someone doing painting, doing art to deal with this. And then I start reading further on, and that's exactly what she does. She starts painting on rock formations, and she eventually does that with her granddaughter as well, who goes on to become an artist, the first person of this part of the Evenki tribe to go on to university, which is really, really lovely, but unsurprisingly doesn't end so well in this novel.
Do you know, going back to that question of whether it's sad or not, I found her, Irina, the saddest character of any of them. And I think they're kind of, she to me represented a kind of perfect sort of half and half person between, the person she was born as and the person she became, because she is simultaneously celebrating her culture and, uniquely able to paint it and to portray it, but she also exploits it for money. And there's a kind of a tension in her, I think.
Is there an excitement when she brings a TV crew into the tribe, and the main character, the nameless narrator, who's now 90 years old, or approaching her 90th year at that time, kind of just turns away when they start asking her a question, because she was once married to the last chieftain of this Evenki tribe. And I found that really quite sad, but also quite realistic. I could definitely imagine a lot of these scenes happening. I imagine the character management is very good in terms of the different personalities. I thought, I think earlier in your comments you picked up on this being an environmental novel quite strongly. I found myself reflecting at the end, did it deserve that, and should it have fit in with what it is, part of the Vintage Earth series, which I'm going to bring out. I think we've got most of them. So this is the Vintage Earth series. There's some very famous ones. Here we go. I just got the thumbs up. You can see them here. I'll put those on our social media when this episode goes out. We have some that you may have heard of, definitely. The Overstory, which has been a bit of a revelation in the Cli-Fi kind of area by Richard Powers. There's some other famous names. Ian McEwan is in there, but I won't go through them all. But did you think that the book deserved to be in this series?
Well, maybe shall I read the kind of little manifesto at the back? Because I think you kind of need to hear that to maybe also to make your own decision as a book club reader. But it says, change the story. Vintage Earth is a collection of transformative novels brimming with the power and beauty of the natural world. Each one is a work of creative activism, a blast of fresh air, a seed from which change can grow. Discover great writing on the most urgent story of our times. I'd say it's a pretty worthy inclusion in that series. It's I mean, I suppose that there's a kind of, it almost asks the bigger question, doesn't it? Of kind of, because there is a lack of urgency in her writing. She's not in the author's writing, but in our narrators. Okay. In fact, actually, sorry, Sam, I'll rephrase that. There's a lack of urgency in her storytelling. She is not up on a soapbox saying, save my people, look at my culture dying. There is a kind of, not an inevitability in how she sees it, but she's not an activist as a narrator. And I actually don't know. I mean, I couldn't learn much about the author online, but she doesn't seem to particularly be an activist either.
Well, one of the questions I have is this published in China? Has it got past the Chinese censors? And I don't know the answer to that.
Well, it
I
won
think
a Chinese literary prize.
so. It probably did then.
Yeah.
I was going to ask some of my Chinese friends actually, but I haven't got WeChat on my phone anymore.
Say in there, sometimes it will say on the copyright page where it was first.
Because that's probably why, to a degree, it is. Those censorship laws definitely shape the literary culture in China, for sure. So it is quite light on some of the history, maybe for that reason. But what I was thinking at the end is there is this tectonic shift which has occurred around the world in the end of the nomadic phase of humanity. And you kind of witness this through this novel. And I think that is such a profound and important story that you are privileged enough to be able to read through the work of Chi Zijian, that I would recommend the book. And I think it firmly sits on the shelves of Sherlock and Pages for that reason. I like the fact that it's been included in the Vintage Earth series because it's not particularly preachy. The story of deforestation is so obvious in the novel, it doesn't need to preach about it. But that has had devastating effects in China. Forestation rate in China went below 10%. This destabilized the land, and a lot of the problems of air pollution are actually caused by huge sandstorms mixing with the pollution of the big cities. And so there are huge programs to reforest these areas like Heilongjiang and Inner Mongolia now. So I think without being too obvious, it opens up a whole range of questions, practical and spiritual, about who we are. And I'd be really happy to recommend it on that basis in the shop, I would say. It's my kind of final word on the book.
You have spoken.
I have spoken, yeah. But I wouldn't say it was one of my top 5, but I'm scared of my top 5 authors list now. So we'll have to get back to that.
Yeah.
Well, in truth, yeah, that is partly one of the reasons is I really want the book club at Sherlock and Pages to have a range of different voices from around the world. I think that this was one that a lot of people said they wouldn't necessarily have picked up unless we'd recommended it. And I'm so glad that it kind of wasn't too complex, too overbearing for people, even though it's such a different history to, I think, our main geographies are European, Western cultures, broadly put, North America and Australasia. So I think it's a really valuable pick to start us off.
Yeah, I mean, also not to now get on a pedestal about it, but, you know, when you buy a novel in translation, you vote with your feet for these kind of things to keep being available. You know, it's very expensive for publishers to commission translations. It's always a big risk. And yeah, I just would recommend anyone to kind of try and read a large amount of translated fiction.
Well, I think we managed to get about 150, possibly even moving towards 200 people to buy The Last Quarter of the Moon. So in our own little way,
you're doing your bit.
We're doing our bit, and if everyone can recommend it to a few friends, that kind of snowballs. So yeah, let's see if we can get some more for the next round of Sherlock and Pages book club picks, which we will be announcing in the coming weeks, and we've been discussing here. So they're all going to be quite different, and we're going to have a mix of fiction and non-fiction, and we're going to try and keep it lively. We're basically going to try and reflect what Sherlock and Pages is all about, which is, what do you think Sherlock and Pages is all about, Becky?
Great books at affordable prices. No,
It's definitely not that.
Nature, history, heritage, art, the environment.
I think that's fair. Yeah. I describe our bookends as landscape and history and heritage, and then with a whole lot of nature in between.
It's a nice way of putting it.
I always say we can't compete on price with the big players, Amazon, but we can compete on soul and heart.
Yeah, and I'll wave my little vote with your feet flag again. Support your local independent bookshops.
Of course. And thank you for those who have supported us through the book club. It has been an amazing experience. I hope you can continue supporting us, because we're really taking a bit of a gamble on this. But yeah, finally, thank you, Becky, for taking your time, not only in being here today, but in reading the book. I know you have so much reading to do for your job.
It was
so it's
a
really
real
appreciated.
pleasure it was like a little holiday.
Well,
A little
hopefully
book
it's
holiday.
something different.
I loved it.
Oh,
I loved it.
thank you so much.